Keep fussing with this, maybe while you try to grab another one. Maybe, or are there fresh batteries somewhere? Oh, thank you. Are we at time? Oh yeah, we're at time. Yeah. Okay, we're having a little problem with the remote clicker here, so why don't we? If you've got one that just plugs in, sure. I mean, I can do the chair slides from here, but I think it's easier for other folks to be able to advance their own slides. Yes, I did test it and it worked. I'm not sure I trust it. Okay, let's try this one. Oh, that's interesting. Yours works. Ooh, cool. Oh, this looks like an Apple thingy. It just looks like it looks like a trademark infringement. Okay, let's get started. I think the agenda is well, even though we have had short agendas in this meeting so far, I don't think we've ever actually ended early. So I'm assuming that we're going to be pressed for time by the time we get to 3:30. Blue sheets are going around. This is the Transport Services Working Group. If you don't know what Transport Services or TAPS are, then you stay and watch and learn. Teresa is going to jabber scribe for us. That's helpful for the minute taker to get your name. So if she's looking at you funnily, it's probably she's trying to read your badge. We have a minute taker in the back. I see you are. Okay, so we need a minute taker. So Sarah Banks and her son were going to tag team doing the minutes as a kind of a learning exercise, but it looks like Sarah's been delayed. So could somebody get started in the Etherpad, and then when Sarah gets here, I'm using Miria's clicker.
Oh, okay.
Why don't you leave that one and take this one, and I'll try it at the end of the session. And we will be no worse off than we are now if it doesn't work.
Batteries?
Oh yeah. Well, you should take those with the old one.
What am I doing then?
You're giving me that, and you're taking.
No, there's
Oh, you just have batteries. Oh, okay. Well, okay. I'll try the batteries.
Okay.
There we go. Thank you.
See if that works.
All right. Appreciate it. Okay, so a minute taker. Somebody, please. Well, what we really need is for somebody to capture the action items, right? You don't need to record everything that's said. Thank you, Gory.
Gory first will take notes because he hasn't worked on the drafts this time.
Okay, as your penance. Awesome. All right. Note well, anything that is said in this room is considered an IETF contribution. If you don't know what that is, you should read some of that stuff. Here's today's agenda. You may not be surprised if this agenda looks familiar, because this is almost exactly the agenda from the interim meeting, where we made some progress on the issues, but there are still some open elements. And so today we're going to try to push some of those along. So we haven't published any RC since before. The MinSet draft is sitting in the RC editor queue. It's got a misref. It's waiting for the security document to be submitted, and then they'll be published together. We did complete a working group last call for the survey of transport security protocols. So thanks for the folks who read and commented on that. For the document to proceed, it needs a shepherd. A shepherd is ideally somebody who's not an author, but is willing to be an intermediary. I think I see a volunteer. I haven't even told you what you're going to be doing, but Philip, thank you. Consider yourself signed up. For those of you who don't know what a shepherd is a person who makes sure that the authors respond to feedback that comes in the review cycle, the IETF last call, the area directors reviews, and tries to make sure that the right discussion happens so the document progresses. So thank you very much, Philip. So that means that is my area director here? Magnus. So Magnus, you should expect this within the next day or so, once I can fill out the form. Yeah, we had an interim. Many of you were there virtually. It was a virtual interim. And we talked about framing. What is it? The implementation draft, which continues to evolve and mature as we learn more. And then about how default parameters are represented. Should applications be able to ask for things without giving the parameters and have something happen? The Yang model, which we've talked about here a couple of times, was discussed, and people continue to think it's a good idea. And then there's a bunch of open issues with the architecture and the API draft. This is our schedule. It's unchanged since the last IETF. So the goal here is to submit the architecture, implementation, and API drafts for publication by November. I suspect that the implementation draft won't be done, but it sure would be nice if we could all agree that the architecture and the API drafts are done. I don't know if it is, but if those of you, during the conversation today, it'd be interesting to hear people's input on that, just so that we can kind of set expectations. That either the computer is frozen or that's my last slide. So I think we should move on. The computer appears not to be frozen. Okay, so.
Ready. Yeah.
All right.
All right. Hello. All right. Hi, I'm Tommy Pauly, and I'm going to give a quick update on the state of framers. And we have renamed them in the document to message framers, so we can put all of our messages in frames. All right. Is this going? Boop. Can you make it full screen?
I did.
Is it? Okay. The clicker's not working then.
Try now.
Or now it's okay. Click it.
Not full screen. Ooh, that's interesting. Why don't you stop clicking for a moment and let
Okay.
me try to get it into a, that looks right. Okay, see if it works. So you want the up arrow?
Nope.
All right, well that's, ask Miriam then. How about you just tell me?
I will just tell you. Great. All right. So as a status update, we did have a pull request to rewrite how we do framers, and this was based on our discussion that we had last time at IETF 104 as well as in the interim. So we did merge that in. There were still some open questions or thoughts that people had, so we said we'd kind of come back to those, potentially revise the text in accordance with that once we've landed it. So I want to cover those today. And then I also want to share that we did release a version of the framing API in our network framework within Apple systems for Swift and C. And so we have that in our iOS and macOS beta currently. So this is a way to implement framers, and you can play with it and you can test it out and see how it feels to hold. And you can see also how some of the practicalities of like putting this into a concrete language turn out. So, Okay, so I want to first cover essentially what the API surface looks like currently for framing based on this latest PR. So if you are an application and you have your connection and you would like to add some sort of message framing into it, let's say you have a TLV format over a TCP stream, you can create a message framer object like this, new message framer, and that's the thing that you can register all your events on to handle framing and deframing data. And then you can add this framer onto your pre-connection. Now, the way the text currently describes it is that you add them on, and each one you add kind of goes onto the stack closer to the application. So you could add a lower level one and then maybe hand your connection to someone else and they could add on more framers. One of the issues that was raised, I think by Max, was wasn't super clear what happens to the order of all the events when you have multiple framers going on. So we will want to clarify that the intention I have here is you essentially will get any start events to start framing from the bottom, from the transport up in that order. You have a question?
Yeah, do you ever need multiple framers? Because you could also just like create one framer that is a little bit more complex than stacking framers on top of each other.
You certainly could. I think the reason to have multiple is for more code reuse. Let's say you have like a basic, like, let's say I'm doing something for a DNS framing that can work over TCP and UDP. I could have one that just does like the length value framing over TCP, and then one that strips out some of the headers and does more interpretation that can work over both TCP and UDP. And so I would want to compose them separately.
But that's more an implementation question than an architectural question.
You could certainly do it that way, but since the it's not necessarily the TAPS implementers, but it's more like third-party apps or third-party libraries that would want to be implementing framers, we should at least define what is possible for them to do. But that's a good point. So once you've added your framer, you can add specific things that you want to communicate to your framer when you're sending and receiving. So there's a message context that we already have as part of our send and receive calls. And so right now it specifies that you can add kind of special values specific to your framer onto that send to receive to say, you know, when you're sending your header, add this specific value. So if you had an HTTP framer, you could put your header values in there so they could lay it out. Similarly, when you are receiving, you are able to look at the message context and see the properties of how it was deframed. So there is an open issue kind of around this that I'll get to in a second. Then there are some events around kind of the framer lifetime of saying, hey, this message framer is now actually active on a connection. The connection got far enough in setting up the transport that you are ready to start framing, or the connection has closed, you should stop framing now. This just allows you to prepare and clean up. Similarly, when you if you are writing a framer, you can send it events to say, okay, I'm ready for more application data. The connection is now ready from my perspective. Or you can say, I hit some error. There's some invalid message that came in. Just fail this connection. One of the points brought up in the issue is that sometimes you need to be able to close a connection without having an error on it. So one way to solve this is to just rename fail connection to like close connection. You can have an optional error or have two different methods to do that. Yes.
One more question. So why do you need actually to add your framer to the pre-connection?
So what's the other option that you're thinking of? Add it just to a connection?
Just add it and make it active immediately, and then if you remove it, it's gone, right?
So at least the way we have things right now, you get your connection the moment you call initiate. And so if that action of initiate is asynchronous, you know, the connection could become fully ready before you've added your framer, which is okay if you haven't sent or received anything. But if you, let's say you had already started receiving bytes or you had already started sending somehow, then you're adding your framer at an unknown point in the stream of data and you don't know if it's actually valid to start parsing where you are. It's just a little bit less safe.
Is there a case where you need the framer? There's probably a case where you need the framer in the handshake or in
Yes.
the startup phase as well.
Right, because it may need to send a prefix before it begins framing, saying like, this is the type of framing I'm doing to the other side. So that's why it's currently in the pre-connection. I think if we wanted it to not be in the pre-connection, you'd need to split out the create connection from the initiate.
Yeah, the other part was like, do you actually need this kind of preheat phase where you add your framer and then activate it later, right? You don't really need it, I guess.
Well, so this is not Which part are you talking about? The start call or the make it ready?
No,
The start?
the start.
So the start event can generally be ignored. It's mainly if you need to send some like prefix to do like a little extra thing before you begin framing messages, it's your opportunity to do that.
Okay.
Or allocate memory or whatever you need to do. It should be very simple or short.
Okay.
Hi, Colin. So these on this slide, these are events given to the framer, not something you have to something you have to implement if you're just using a framer. These are things you implement if you're building a framer.
Right. So yes, these are for people who build the code that is framing and deframing. It's not for the application sending and receiving data.
Yes. Okay. Just coming back, I think somewhat to Miria's point, certainly the model I had of this was that framers would be implicit based on the transport parameters. And being able to add them explicitly seems like a reasonable thing, but I think we should arrange things so they could be implied.
Yes.
If you say I'm creating an HTTP, I deliver HTTP things, it should imply there's an HTTP framework.
Yes.
You shouldn't need to explicitly plan that in.
Right. And so this PR didn't go as far as to do that, but I agree that that should be done implicitly for a lot of protocols that are framed. Yeah. Okay.
One question, as the framer currently has to be added to the pre-connection, can we use it still to implement things like star TLS at the moment?
Yes. So I don't think I have it on these slides. There is a method for a framer or a protocol to prepend another protocol or framer on top of it. I think it's called prepend framer. And so what you would do is you would do your start TLS and then you would add on this other framer on top.
So you have to add the first framer at the pre-connection, but this framer could later on add our framer.
Yes, right. And essentially this all has to happen before the connection becomes fully ready, because otherwise you don't know whether or not the application has sent and received data and you're in some weird intermediate state between boundaries. Yeah.
So I think I'm asking a variant of this topic, which is, do you still believe that if I am using TAPS with a framer on one half of the connection or the other half of the connection, that I only need to do it on one side, that it will still work fine end to end, that there's no additional semantics in here?
Right.
Or knowledge that the application can convey it to the stack in either on the sender or the receiver side.
So you could have a TAPS or non-TAPS implementation just doing a TCP stream on one end that does its own HTTP.
Oh yeah, that I understand.
And another side that does a framer with HTTP.
Yeah. But then when you start stacking them, I feel like it gets a little confusing. But things are listening on ports.
It's still the same on the wire protocol. This is about how we signal to the application.
Right. So there's no TAPS to TAPS signaling in getting these framers.
Correct. Yeah, there's nothing on the wire. Great. Yes.
You want to what?
Yeah, if you want to do your own TAPS signaling.
No, I think that is
document.
explicitly, that's an anti-requirement for TAPS, right? That we can't require both ends deploy.
Right. All right. So then on the data path, there's a new sent message that the application is trying to send. You can look at that and you can send your own data to frame it. And when you're receiving, you say, there is new received data on this connection, and then you can parse it. You can say, all right, I'm done looking at this, and you can deliver data up. That's kind of the basics that you need to do. I don't include all of the parameters here, but they are in the document. So some of the questions that came up in the course of the PR, these are just kind of like side things that we want to get our opinions on. One, I think Michael had brought up of like, I had originally been discussing these framers as like protocols in the stack. I've backed off of that mainly. The question is like, should we be calling them protocols? Currently we don't. I think that's fine. There was also a question about like, how much should we be referring to things as objects. I kept it as objects for now because most of the API document really does refer to objects and stuff like that. It does raise a broader question of, is this the way that we want to be referring to kind of the operational functions that we have within the document? I think it's clean, but if people are allergic to that, that's fine too.
Jonathan, I had a question, I guess, sort of about the difference between the TAPS model proper and the Apple Network Framework.
Mhm.
As I recall, Apple Network Framework doesn't actually have pre-connections. So where are you attaching the framers?
Pre-connection equals parameters for us.
Okay,
They're the same.
but, and on server-side stuff where there's a
Mhm.
single, I mean, because presumably a framer, the object that is a framer corresponds to a single connection. I mean, you might have a constructor or a factory for these things, but there's a single instance of this per connection.
Yes.
So whereas your, like, whether listener object can accept multiple different connections. So how does that?
Right. So that's an interesting question. So this is partly brought up in some of the discussion on the PR. The way that the current PR describes it is that you have a message framer object that you create to represent kind of the abstract of your framer. And all of the functions here take the connection that's specific. So essentially, when you get a start, it means this instance of the framer corresponding to that connection is being created. In the way that we did it in Network Framework, we actually have it be that you define your own class that conforms to a protocol, and we instantiate your object new for every connection. They boil down to the same thing, but they do look semantically a little different.
Teresa Enghardt, about the questions what a framer is or whether they are protocols, I think they are one possible way to implement parts of some protocols, not the only way to implement them, but possible. I find them really useful. When I explain them to people, I usually say they are a sort of a set of functions that can transform a message into a byte stream or vice versa, and then maybe do other things on top. So the draft right now says it's a piece of code. I think that's too implementation specific.
So a set of functions. That's great.
It even says simple transformations between message data and raw transport bytes. I wonder what simple transformation really is, right? So maybe we should specify this. Also, the framer that you're specifying does a lot of buffer management, and maybe we can separate the functionality for the transformation from the actual buffer management, right? So maybe we have like multiple things that the framer does. Maybe we want to separate them, or also maybe we don't want to be so specific in the API draft to standardize how the framer is implemented, right?
If you could open an issue for what you're discussing, that'd be great.
So before we launch into this discussion, I just want to point out that we're at the end of time for this slot.
Great.
So this is, I think, we've been wrestling with framers for a while, and so it's worth talking about this. Did you have a lot more in your deck?
No,
to
so
present?
the only other thing, and this is just for reference, if you look at the slide deck, I have a link to some of our sample code for what framers look like in Swift, and I include some of it here. So you can just see how it looks. We don't need to go through that now. It's too hard to read. It's a reference for you.
Okay, so let's have some discussion.
So Eric Kinnear, Apple, just to what Teresa was saying, I think I like that view of the problem in that a framer at its most basic is kind of serializing and deserializing a byte stream into something that's messages. And then if you want to go farther with that and have it do something semantically with those messages, like maybe a framer would do a handshake for you at the beginning of some protocol, like that's kind of up to you if you want to define that, but you could also have the thing that the client application could read out that delineated message and do the logic for the handshake. But I think that's a nice way to communicate it to people because it's pretty easy to grasp, like, I've got this logical message, I would like it to be a byte stream. And from there, the rest of it kind of falls out.
That's good.
So towards the second question, I had a hard time understanding the PR at the first place. And it got for me much easier when I thought of the framer object as a framer buffer manager, and then having a different object communicating with that buffer manager. But this brings me to the question whether the actual API that is is exposed at the moment is a little bit too much focused on the buffer management and a little bit less focused on how to compose multiple framers and how to really stack these concepts or how to build up these concepts. This is my current problem with this API.
So,
By the way, I like what I've seen by the slides flickering through from the NV Connections framework. I like this much better than what's in the abstract API.
you like which much better?
The one from the NV
This?
Connections was really having a protocol class that implements the framer itself.
Okay. That's good. That was a little bit more what my initial PR was trying to get at. So just to clarify what you mean, so the data path does, involve some buffer management. And to be clear, the part that a TAPS implementation needs to provide is the ability to, interact with the data path. So there will be this buffer management. So, do we agree that these kind of functions, just like sending and receiving, will exist kind of in this form?
I'm not sure whether they really have to exist in this form. If you're going for a much more functional language, or if you think about that you might want to push framers, for example, down into hardware offloading, or which do something like the Linux implementation, which have something framer-like that's implemented in eBPF. If you want to enable this kind of stuff, the buffer management might look quite differently. That's the reason why I have a little bit of a problem with it. I think it's a nice way. It's one nice way of implementing the framer, but I'm not sure whether it's the only way of implementing the framer.
I see. Right. To that end, we could define it as this is a way to do it. You must have at least these capabilities. If you want to express it differently in your implementation, that is fine. It partially gets down to the reusability of code, though. Like if, we would ideally want someone who wrote a basic implementation of how to do HTTP framing on top of something to be able to be somewhat portable. And so having something that is common is useful in that regard.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Okay.
But the question is whether we can make a little bit more cut through the framer API, saying, okay, this is the way how you add frame to a connection or to a pre-connection, and then have, okay, this is how you implement a framer. And if you want to have an implementation-specific other way to implement framers, you still have some kind of framer representation you can add. And whether this comes from a library or is compiled from eBPF or something else that's not portable, that's fine. Still, you have a common way to add this framer to the stack.
Yes, and I think that we should leave that open for implementations to do if they want.
Okay, let's try to move through the queue quickly and then close out this discussion.
Teresa Inghart, maybe this is what you just said, but I suggest moving parts of this framer implementation to the implementation draft and keep the way that the application adds the framer to the pre-connection and the set of functionality that the framer should implement in the API draft, and put other stuff in the implementation draft, or maybe a separate draft if this really grows out of proportion.
Yeah, Max Frank is in the same way. Having tried to implement framers or partially implemented this new model of framers, a lot of the way the API works is like, for example, in Python, it's really painful to do it like that way. It would be much easier to do, and I think that's like an implementation specific, like the communication between the framer and the connection. I don't think that has to be standardized in the API. I think part of it should be moved to implementation, as Teresa said, or the separate draft. And we talked about that briefly at Hackathon, right? There's a lot of implications from the way this works. So if we want to standardize it this way, we would have to add like a lot of comments to the implementation draft. Like
Yes, that's
a
true.
massive amount, because there's so many implications on how the rest of the connection works. We had talked about receive, that the max length is basically somewhat becoming irrelevant if a framer is active, because the framer is going to frame how much data it wants and not how much the connection and the application says it should frame.
Hi, Colin Pickens. I think again I'm agreeing with Teresa. I think What we have here is certainly one way of doing it. I think it's possibly too concrete for the architecture interface.
Well, it's not in the architecture, but in the API.
In the interface and the
Yeah.
API, it's one implementation strategy. So certainly it doesn't look like the way I had thought of implementing it. That's not saying it's bad, it's just saying it's different. And different languages have different styles.
Exactly. So one thing before you go, just so I can comment, so you can respond.
I'm just going to agree with Teresa too. So
Great. Yeah, I am agreeing as well. What that means is that essentially what we are left with in the API, just to clarify, is we have to have a way to add it, and we have to have a way to send information to it. So this is the part I'd like a little bit more input and scrutiny on, because
And at some point we should describe what conceptually it does in that it's a parser or a serializer.
yes.
And buffer manager and that.
Oh yeah, we'll describe what it does.
Abstract else, if that's-
And then the implementation can say, this is one way to do it. One of the issues that was raised for adding information to the context is like, it's a little bit vague. And I think in general, we could have better text around like, how do we, when we're sending something, how do we tell IP or UDP what options to send? How do we tell a framework what to send? It's not super rigorous. And I think that's the part that is going to be most important if this is the only thing that gets exposed.
so you have these questions up here, so I'll answer them. Hi, Brian Trammell. No, not anymore, not necessary, not really, not necessary. Cool, we can move on. So yeah, message framers are not protocols. They're a special kind of thing. We have that we have this idea that we want to kind of like generalize these things to be objects that we can tack on. I think that's dangerous, because if we do that, we're going to use it. We shouldn't give ourselves like a foot gun, because it gets really tempting to and yeah, so you're asking a question. If you go back to the here about whether there is a better way to represent how to give metadata to the framer.
Yeah.
I think if you want to do a better way to give metadata to the framer, then you have to go and have this whole object model for what those metadata objects look like, and then the metadata objects and the framer objects are like. I think this is the point at which we can say like, yeah, this is an abstract API, but like too much abstraction is leads to something that's sort of like unimplementably abstract. And key value pairs are kind of, we understand them, we know how they work.
Yeah.
This is a little bit ugly, but it's a completely acceptable amount of ugliness. If you go to the next slide, yeah, this seems like it can go in the implementation
that's fine.
draft. If you go to the next slide,
That would also be.
advanced receive cursor. I've done too much with like bad database libraries that the word cursor just makes me kind of itch. And yeah, like so Phil's point here is that yeah, there's a lot of languages in which, you know, a single threaded cursor is not the model that you want. So I would not even put this in the, I would maybe put this as an example in implementation, the implementation draft, but make it very clear that there's a bunch of different ways to do this. And I think that it's absolutely correct to say that different environments are going to have different ways of implementing framers. And we should feel okay leaving that up to the implementers.
Great. Thank you.
Do you have another slide of questions that I can answer?
No, that's the only one.
Yeah, cool. Thanks.
What it might make, sorry, what it might make sense to do is sketch out a couple of very different styles of implementation. Here is an example of how one might do it in a pure functional language, for example.
Right.
And here's how one might do it in Swift.
Yeah, so if we could get another one for like the Python implementation, that'd be good.
Just to show that there are radically different ways of building the same thing.
Great.
Yeah, Max Frankel, really quick. For example, the add thing with the TLV is completely unnecessary in Python, right? Because the data object is typeless and that you hand over to the send anyway, so it can already include its own metadata. So that's
Great. Is that done? So great. Did you get in the minutes comments about refactoring this into the implementation and API draft? Okay.
Great.
Awesome. Okay, thank you, Tommy. Uh-oh.
Michael. Go next door.
Not until I get the slide deck.
Okay. Chong chong, yeah, sort of, somehow.
It scrolls halfway.
There we go. Try now.
Yeah. Woo. All right. I'm quite glad, how this framework discussion has turned out. I would have said, this kind of stuff that we're doing now is way less important. So I mean, this should be a quick and easy one. Actually, let's see. Yeah, but I mean, it's a much smaller question than the framer stuff. Ah, okay.
I'll let you get to your next slide.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. See, I'm starting off easy. The first question is there anybody that really, really, really hates the idea of us allowing that we can specify, that somebody can specify a specific protocol?
Brian Trammell with a philosophical question. Can you define allow?
Can I, what? Sorry.
Can you define the word allow? There are two ways to allow this, right? You can essentially say either in the abstract API, we have a way to do this, and in order to be compliant with TAPS, whatever that means, you must have a way to do this.
Yes.
Or you can say, hey, if you're implementing a TAPS stack, that you might want to do this. And the only really good reason I can see for doing this is if you're essentially doing recursive TAPS, right? So you're building an L4 plus protocol, like you're going to build WebSockets as a protocol that you're going to make available in TAPS, built on top of its own TAPS implementation, where you absolutely must then specify that this new stack has to live on top of this older stack. Does that make any sense? We need whiteboards for this, I think. Like there are two reasons to basically say I want to explicitly specify a protocol. One is you're a lazy application developer and you just want what you want and you know that you want it and you write something on Stack Overflow that says just flip the TCP switch on and then everything will work fine.
These are the people that I think we should support. No? I mean, because they exist, right?
Okay. Well, hold on. Actually, I don't want to go all the way down this rabbit hole.
Yeah.
I want to ask my allow question. There are two ways to allow this. One is you put it in the abstract API and you say you must support it. The other thing is you say, hey, if you want to do this, then do some implementation specific way of doing it. Because the point at which you're building a TAPS application that you want to force a protocol on, you're kind of getting into the internals of the system anyway, and we can just kind of say, yeah, you can do that, but do it on the side, and you don't have to do it in a standard way.
I'm still struggling to understand the second version. The second version sounds like you're trying to make it harder for people to do it. Yeah, I mean, okay, discourage, yes, but discourage by making it explicitly hard to use, I don't think is a good...
by making it a socket option, which is how we discourage things in APIs in the past. Just stick it behind a socket option.
Yeah.
You're doing a dangerous thing. It should be ugly and painful.
Nah,
So Michael,
I don't like this.
You asked for input. You're getting input.
Yeah.
Let's let some other people talk.
Yeah, sure.
Hi, I'm Gory Fairness. I didn't take that down, Brian, because I couldn't understand it. But you can just add it. Yeah, I mean, how about signaling protocols that wants to do simultaneous open? I mean, you say I want to open a port with this protocol, and then your API has to let you do this. It's a simple use case, but it exists.
Yeah.
So don't make it impossibly hard.
I agree with that. I mean, I think discourage in the sense of writing that, this is not the encouraged way to do it, and this shouldn't be like the obvious default way to do it, but making it hard on purpose seems weird. Okay, yes.
Colin, just to be clear, when you say specify a protocol, you mean say I want TCP with exactly this set of options.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're building a general purpose networking API, then we need to be able to specify everything which is possible. So everything the stack can do. At some point, someone is going to want. I want exactly this protocol.
Well,
Can't do it with this API. then you fail.
I agree with this. Yes. I mean, I'm trying to see if there are people that have an issue with that, or like if we all simply agree with this, which I hoped.
We want by default for the stack to make a sensible selection for us. But
Yes.
if we have a specific preference, we want to be able to express that.
Yes, exactly. That's the proposal there.
This is Tommy. So yes, I think we should say that the API should allow you to specify a protocol, but we should not. So we should say your implementation should allow you to do this, not a must. But it should specifically say that it is up to the implementation how it wants to express this, and that it is not standardized. Because I think if we do try to standardize how it is, then we need a registry of all of the protocols that you can enumerate explicitly. We don't want to get into that. Right, exactly. So we should allow you to specify it somehow. It's up to you. And I think one of the reasons in favor of allowing people to do it some way, in this specific way, is if we do not, then there is, I think, more danger that someone who really needs to be able to specify something specifically will kind of like ossify around using certain transport selection options to always get TCP, and
Yeah.
when we change that, they'll be upset.
Yeah.
So let's encourage and have the standard way be always protocol agnostic, but just say you should do it.
Yeah, regarding the point of not standardizing it, I mean, there are, the next slides talk about these concrete proposals of profiles. So this is a bit slightly in that direction, right? Of whether you take them as a, okay. Yes, sorry.
Yep, I'm understand. So I basically agree, and to me, I thought the typical use case of this would be that you want to write your application in a TAPS compliant way, but you know that at this point, the other end, you support one protocol. So you can make it more efficient by also saying that,
Yeah, also for,
right now I pick this protocol. because
even just for
there's no-
testing, right?
There's no point in having
Yeah.
all the racing and selection if I already know what the other end support.
Yeah.
So a quick chairs interrupt here. So Michael has 8 minutes left in his slot. He's clearly got something to say. He said it was short. We should let him get through it. So the question is, Myriad, you're next in line. Ask yourself,
Okay, stay on that.
should it wait?
I think we should make it a little bit hard, because otherwise it's just too easy to, like, you have an existing implementation and then you just, like, the easiest way to move it over is just saying, please use TCP, right? So it should be a little bit hard, and I actually agree to this approach where we say it should be possible, but we don't specify standardized way for it.
Well, I mean, it's going to be hard in that you have to change it to write to again. You have to write against the new API anyway, right? So it's not like you have an application written on sockets and you just port that and it runs because it's not sockets anymore. So that's already hard.
Yeah, but it shouldn't be easier to port it to the way where you select protocol than porting it to a generic solution.
Yeah.
Teresa Ingert, I think the easiest way to discourage it efficiently is to make profiles easy to use, so everyone will use profiles, and most people who don't care will just use
I
profile,
agree.
not a specific
I agree with
protocol.
that. Yeah.
Can I see the next slide, please?
Yeah, exactly. I should have maybe, yeah, I'm getting the feeling that I should have maybe switched
you
the other.
framed
See,
it
this
wrong.
is, let me try and hop over this, because that is the actual proposal on the table, I think. And yeah, it's probably more useful to discuss this. So, who has read the pull requests? Okay, 1, 2, a couple of people, 3, yeah. No, exactly, the author. Okay, so this is about a pull request that describes profiles and describes, you would choose a protocol by way of choosing a profile that matches onto, for instance, TCP. Yeah.
So,
Discuss.
Actually, I originally got in line to say that I had almost completely changed my mind on what I'd said before, even though nobody understood it. That's probably the cold medicine talking. I continue to really dislike the force transport. I like the fact that it's called force because it kind of feels like, that makes it feel a little bit discouraged. I think we should make it feel a little bit more discouraged than that by like maybe putting like if it's going to be in the document, then it should have like, we should use the blink tag and say don't do this. That's a different PR.
Yeah, it's a different
so
PR. I guess we should probably discuss this. I think that
both of these PRs at the same time, and I was really confused by it because they seemed like alternate proposals to do the same thing.
I think that's what they were. Yeah.
But they were both from Phil, right?
Yeah, maybe
maybe
Philip should go ahead and explain.
So that these are two different proposals. License that Gary volunteered for the second one beforehand, but didn't find time to make it. I think both proposals are not alternatives, but add to each other. So the profiles is like, we have this common use cases. Don't make it so hard that you have to set a bunch of properties. So we have a shortcut to say, I want a reliable in-order stream protocol. Thank you. And whether it's TCP or QUIC, I don't mind. And we have the other one to say, I'm implementing this specific protocol that uses in some of its internal state machine fields from TCP. I know it's a shitty protocol, and now it's shitty, but I really need TCP because of this reason. So please force TCP or UDP because we have timings for both. And therefore, I think these are not alternatives, but these are two ways. One is saying, catch the common case, have a profile that I don't need to add a dozen of properties. And the other one is the reason I really have to force a protocol, and this is a rare case, and this is discouraged, and please don't use it. And we get the fat red blink tag in the compilers. Thank you.
So what about, maybe that's stupid, what about a profile that just has one property in it, and the property name is protocol, and the value is TCP, if I want to pick TCP? So I'm using the same machinery, and it's just what it is?
The property name should be unsafe force protocol, but yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
Like,
I'm taking
shouldn't be
this from-
protocol like, you terrible guy, want to pick a protocol, should be the name.
Protocol is
Yeah.
bad. Your protocol is bad and you should feel bad. Protocol.
But technically, I mean,
Yeah.
that could be just a profile, right?
I don't dislike that as much as I thought I was going to when you first started saying it. That's actually a pretty good idea. Because I do continue to think that the main reason that you would end up like forcing a protocol is because you're doing some low level stuff, right? Which is why I like the term unsafe for this, because that's what sort of like both Rust and Go use, is you're mucking about underneath the compiler and bad things are going to happen to you.
Okay. Philip?
Yeah, I think there's a community of people who don't think that's unsafe. They think that's absolutely required. Remember the woman who came here in the early days of TAPS who was talking about like these highly optimized TCPs and how can TAPS support this? I think that's what this is allowing her to do.
Yeah.
Why are you calling it unsafe? I think that's unnecessarily pejorative.
It needs a different term, but it's like
Yeah.
basically you're disabling TAPS when you do this. So
Yeah.
I'm using the TAPS API, but I'm going to disable the entire engine.
Right. I assume that if you wanted to do that, you would just use TCP or you would just call it directly.
You're
But
not disabling TAPS for this. Even if you have this force protocol property, you can set it multiple times. For example, you can say, I can accept the following stack combinations. So I can accept TCP or SCTP or UDP because I want to talk zip file, for example. And then TAPS can still raise these three against each other.
Yeah, but okay.
But if you want to do, exactly. I mean, if you're going down that path, then you could just as well not specify these three protocols, but the service that you want, right?
No. You really need one of these protocols because your bindings in zip explicitly require TCP or explicitly have some weird knowledge that they use some fields of TCP.
Yeah.
That's the case for it.
Okay. I can imagine that, yes.
okay, we're running out of time in this slide, so let's try to go through the queue.
There's somebody remote, I think.
Actually, I'm answering people. I should be only moderating this. That's not even my proposal. It feels like. Yeah. So you go ahead, you people.
Okay, Teresa as JavaScript. So I have a comment from Keith Moore. Emo, it is absolutely essential for apps to be able to specify transport protocols. My experience is that there's too many subtle differences from one transport protocol to another to expect apps to run successfully over arbitrary protocols. Second, by permitting arbitrary transport protocols, you make testing of apps and support into nightmares. It's one thing if an app can support and is tested on n protocols for small n, and that's potentially useful, but arbitrary number of protocols is unworkable. Using profiles is inviting more variability between endpoint situations and more ways for an application to fail in mysterious ways.
Also a point.
Okay, Jahan.
No, he didn't say must always, he said must be able to.
Must be able to. So thanks for going ahead with this discussion, because I actually had read the PR and I was thinking like you guys will be discussing more on these pull requests. So, I mean, one question that was biting me about when I was hearing the discussion, and that's why I'm here, it was like, well, when do we need a specific specify a protocol? If TAPS is doing its job, say like, okay, you have properties you can see, and how hard it is for me as an application developer to engineer, okay, these are the properties give me TCP, these are the properties give me UTP. So when do I need to specify? What is the reason? I can hear one reason like, well, one very specific application is only working with TCP because they have shim layer and stuff like that.
Yeah, it could be that your server is listening on that protocol only, on that port, and you want to...
Then that's to me is a like a corner case. But those are not like, they should not really try to use TAPS at all because they have that specific requirement. So, I mean, to me, as an application developer, I would say like, okay, if I can specify a protocol that I like, be good, but then I will use some other stack than TAPS. For me, if I can, I mean,
yeah, exactly. We're trying to replace them all.
I have to replace that someday. Yeah. So I think what I want to say, like, okay, make a decision here that makes the application developer to get what they need. And that's the use case of the TAPS for me. Otherwise, I'm not going to use TAPS. I'm going to use like something that gives me a specific protocol, because I am using TAPS because I would like to get the best optimal transport services. So that's my requirement when I'm thinking of using TAPS.
Yeah, but that's clear.
So,
I mean, that's what it's all about.
Certainly the view I have is that we are building an API for the long term. What we're building should be capable of being the only way of accessing the network on a machine. It's a complete replacement for sockets in the long-term future. So you can't say don't use TAPS because there won't be an alternative in the eventual nirvana we're potentially aiming for.
That you can aim for.
And you have to
I do not believe what's on the slide is the right way to specify TCP, because there are many protocols that could satisfy those behaviors. I think we do need a way of explicitly saying, I want TCP. I don't want a reliable, ordered, congestion-controlled, preserving message boundaries protocol. I want TCP.
Yeah, so...
But it's not a bad thing if an implementation says, I want TCP.
So
if
the method
is not a bad programmer. That's a perfectly reasonable thing for them to want.
Yeah, I'd like.
We provide
okay.
more general tools which they can use to do the connection racing and all that because we think they're beneficial. But if they want to be able to say, I want TCP, that's okay.
I'd like to get a feel for my proposal of just saying a property is a protocol and the name is TCP as one of these profiles. So would that be something that you like?
Yeah.
Because I think, you know, I think that could work as a way.
So Michael,
But TCP are not unsafe. I'm a bad programmer.
so let's go. So Michael, one question for me. I mean, when you say like I have a profile in TCP, do you expect that they only provide that one, or do you expect that they also put some kind of required value here? Because I can make a mistake that I want TCP, but the required value gives me something else.
Yeah, that was just.
Then basically, if you specify a profile I want TCP, you don't need all these things.
Right.
Okay. But that's not in the PR. I mean, that's
No. That would be just a very simple profile that has only that. Yeah.
Tony Pauly, Apple. So, well, one comment just to Colin's point. Right now on the watch, we actually only allow taps or things based on top of it. You can't do sockets directly. So there's so you have but more practically for this, I
Watch
think-
tomorrow, today.
Yeah. If I don't like the profile proposal if we also expose what we currently have in the document, because it's essentially another way of saying the same thing. It's a convenience. I completely believe that every implementation will have conveniences for how to easily set up the common sets of things. However, I don't think we should be defining what those sets are, because they will vary based on different use cases today and use cases in the future. Like our API has kind of default sets of like, here's how to set up the profiles, but that is not required to be, cross implementation compatible. I think if we're looking at kind of forwards to like the Yang model type thing, or being able to describe everything, that could be because it's not really a developer typing it out. If you wanted like a big Yang model, here's my pre-connection, you could go through every property and set it the way it needs to, and you could reuse that. That is essentially a profile. And that's very interesting, but we don't need it in the API itself. And I think it's similar for the protocol-specific stuff. We should say the implementation should have a way to do it, but that's not interesting to make part of the API. I think we need to be smaller in what we're adding. The value that we add as a group is like we have the stuff that we've gone over of the different transport services. We analyze the transport protocols. So we've distilled the set of things and properties that are useful to put in there. So that is the value that we are adding to the API. Doing these other things are not really what the TAPS group is the expert in. It's going to be what the implementations do in the future with it.
So
Makes a lot of sense to me, but I'm not moderating.
I agree with you, but I think Keith made a very good point, which is that there is a requirement here. Applications must be able to specify a legacy protocol if that's what they need.
Yep.
Yeah, but that's a different.
That we don't have to say how it's
Sure.
done, but I think it's an architectural requirement for the abstract API is you have to be able to do that. Otherwise, if you're not requiring that to be supported, then there's a pool of applications users who.
I completely agree.
Okay.
And so I guess like the two options I see there are either something in the document says your implementation must expose some way of setting a particular protocol and may have profiles, but don't say what they are. Or we say, well, we can, if we want, give a specific property name of choose a protocol, but I think that's maybe further than we really need to go.
Yeah.
Okay.
For that.
As I wrote those PRs, I think we still need those mechanisms. So we need a mechanism to explicitly choose one protocol. And I think this one should be part of the core API, because otherwise it makes stuff much less portable.
It would be this.
And as a second one, I think we might need these shortcuts of product profiles that allow to set a common set of properties. And that's really see these profiles as set the following properties. By the way, this enables the second thing. We had a lot of discussion about which should be the defaults for all these properties. By including the profiles, we get rid of a lot of these discussion and say, not the default has to be somehow TCP compatible, but okay, we have a bunch of default profiles and we derive the default settings.
What do you call this? A bundle, which is a profile, and it includes all the defaults, or where you discuss each default and have it listed across the document? It's the same thing, right? Technically.
This difference is if we have a bunch of profiles, for these profiles we have default values, and you can still override them. So you load your pre-connection with a profile, then you get something TCP compatible, and you can add further restrictions or further requirements like 0 RTT. Or you can relax some of these values, but you get rid of the problem as having to completely agree on one set of defaults for the properties, but can say, okay, we move this to the profiles. This is one way to do this. I'm not sure if that's the right way, but this was one reason for this proposal.
Let's cut the line after Anna.
I stop saying my opinion after everyone. It's not like.
Okay, Mia could leave a couple of points because we had multiple discussions here. So on selecting a specific protocol, I would like to step back a little bit and really understand the use case behind that. Because like there were a couple of people who brought up some kind of use case for it, but those are really not convincing for me. For example, if you have a very specified stack, which usually means you have a user space implementation of something, which is whatever minimized because you use it on a certain device or whatever, then you probably don't want tabs. You don't want all the flexibility to get it because you want to make sure that you really, really have that piece that you want. So I'm not sure if that's a convincing use case for me. Also, if your server only supports TCP and you try to open a quick connection to the server, it will not reply. So you anyway have to fall back to TCP. But then, like, that's what we want.
No, I'm going to argue this not. But that's the result from the racing afterwards. That's not something they have to put a priori into the API.
But that's what I'm saying. I don't think you want it in the API because it still will not break the system. So I would understand why this is really required because I didn't see a good case for it. That's the protocol specific part. Profiles, I do agree with Tommy that I think this is very implementation specific, especially I think we shouldn't specify a set of profiles because that's exactly the flexibility we want here. So I would recommend to maybe put it in the implementation draft, but not put it in the API. And this is also another general comment I have. I think we should actually try to like not extend the API too much because the more complex we make it, the less incentives people have to actually implement it. We should stop at some point.
My name is Michael Schoffen, speaking here as TCPM chair. I just want to give a heads up that there are legacy applications that do not only know what protocol they need, they also want to specify individual TCP parameters. And if you're interested in that, please come to the TCPM session. You will learn about one of the use cases there. The specific parameters applications are interested in that case are the keep alive parameters. And if you want to be generic, you will have to think about that level of granularity.
Making access to parameters possible, yeah.
So,
No.
But as I said, I mean, it's just a heads up. Please feel come to TCPM if you're interested in this specific use case. It's a relevant one in the netconf working group.
John Lennox, I'm going to drop a bomb after the line is closed, which is always So I'm going to argue that I actually think that having letting applications have strict control over the protocols they use would actually be a terrible thing for the ecosystem. So the example I'm going to give is, let's say I have an app that runs on a Apple Watch and talking to a Mac OS server. So I'm using Tommy's stack and implementing, let's say, SMTP over TCP. And I implement it today, everything works great. And next year, Tommy deploys quick in his TAPS implementation, and my app suddenly starts doing SMTP over quick in an entirely dumb way, just treating it as though it were TCP. And the IETF says, no, that's not how you should do SMTP over quick. You should use all the great features of quick. But sorry, we have deployed stuff. The only way to do it, in our existing running code is to treat it as though it's done TCP because that's the legacy we got accidentally. And I think that would be a terrible outcome. We don't want that to happen. We don't want protocols to magically come online just because the stack upgraded. That's going to be bad for the ecosystem. We shouldn't do that.
Teresa is JavaScript again for Keith Moore. As an app developer, I would love to be able to find out what options exist to connect to a peer. That doesn't mean I want a lower layer to choose an arbitrary stack and not just legacy protocols. And then I also want to say something as myself. So I'm really in favor of profiles because our target audience for the API draft are application developers, in my mind, who want something nice and shiny and like some new features and who maybe don't want all the details of the transport protocols. I want to make it easy for them to use, right? Like we have those usage examples where we want to show, oh, this API is really nice and easy to use. You don't have to care about all the transport protocol details. For that, I really want profiles. I want to mention they exist. And I would like to have profiles in the API draft that they exist, and the specific profiles can be appendix or somewhere.
On the restaurant, so I think we will need profiles in the implementations, but I agree with Tommy and Mirja that I don't think we should have them in the API draft.
Might I ask a clarifying question to your comment? Do you think we need the profiles as a parameter in the API graph. So not specifying what the profiles are, but there are profiles, and you can put it to you can put it to a pre-connection. Or do you want to don't mention
Not
the
solving
profiles at all in the API?
I would not want them as a parameter. Maybe you can mention that it's possible to, when we describe our transport parameters, we may say it's also for implementations possible to group them in various ways, but I wouldn't put them as a parameter in the API.
So let's maybe try to close this out by taking a couple of hums. So let's have a hum as to whether people think that it is that profiles should be an element of TAPS, setting aside where it's documented. Do we want profiles? Yes or no? Hum for yes.
That was very vague.
I'm trying to be vague. I'm going to drill down. Okay, we don't want profiles. Okay, so everybody, there seems to be a consensus that profiles are useful. Should the existence of profiles be part of the API specification? Hum for yes. Okay. Profiles should not be part of the API specification. The existence of profiles, not the specifics. Okay, so there's a few hums, but it's stronger for yes than no. So you guys look very confused. This all supports what I thought I heard in the line. So
in the API graph saying, if you want to learn something about profiles, please read this other draft, right? It's already mentioned in the API draft.
well, you can whether that now you've got something that's general and can be extensible, right? We don't have to specify all the profiles that should exist.
So I think there are three options, and the Poll 328 is almost one of those options. So option number one is profiles are normative first-order citizens in the API. You must implement them. You should use them. Here's what they are.
Right.
And we're going to even specify and if you're going to do that, you also need to specify a base set of them.
Right.
The second one, which is what the poll request is almost now, is it's in the appendix for saying you could do this.
Mhm.
And then there is a normative reference down to there by saying there's an optional profile thing.
Right.
Where
If you're going to do this, here's how.
Yeah, if you're going to do this, here's how. I think and then the other one is you could
We say
carve
nothing
it off
about
into
it.
its own document and then say, hey, this is, and maybe that document is standards track, and then it's like basically a TAPS extension. It's like, we have TAPS with profiles. And then there is maybe a non-normative reference in the API draft saying, hey, you can have, if you want profiles, go read this other draft, right? Or you could put it in the implementation. So there's a bunch of different.
So do you think you heard a consensus on one of those?
I did not hear a consensus on any of those. I heard a consensus on we want them.
Okay. So I think we're out of time. We're not gonna resolve this here beyond that point. Tommy, unless you think you can state what you think is the unifying solution here that everybody is going to agree on, I think that we're going to have to.
Could we take, so what I was going to say, because I like what Brian was saying about there are three options, because I think there was confusion. So what I was going to propose as the three options were, one, do essentially what the PR is today, of you have profiles and they modify the existing symbols in the API. The abstract API requires that it takes a profile symbol that is part of the API. Two, the API mentions that profile conveniences exist, but it does not modify the existing. Like, you don't take a parameter, you just say, you can build these on top, and you maybe should. And three is you don't mention them at all.
Right.
So I think that might be a clearer hum
Yeah.
to figure out where we land.
Two
Is mentioned that,
Anything an example in the appendix.
right, it's essentially saying like the API can also add a way to create a set of a pre-connection that's pre-configured in a way that's good for this, but it doesn't modify any calls on the pre-connection itself. It just sets it up for you. Those are two different options. But I think those are the degrees that we can go between.
So without trying to muddy the waters further, can we do a hum on that? Do people understand what the three options are enough that they can express a preference? Okay, option one. All right, I heard the vaguest essence of hum, but
Should we restate what option
I was trying not to, because then we're gonna, then I won't do it perfectly, and then we will argue about that.
Can I try a simpler approach? Do it hum now if you want a parameter.
Okay. We've entered a non-terminating process.
Hum now if you don't want to change the interface as it is defined now.
Yeah, we're gonna move on. Here's how I'd like to move on. I would like somebody to propose the options to the list, and we can do an online hum or something equivalent, right? People try not to get too much into editing the questions. Who would like to do that? I think good candidates are Brian, Tommy, Michael, or Miria. Okay.
Yeah, Tommy was
Tommy,
clear,
you're going
pretty
to
clear.
pose the questions to the list. Try to do all, it's still fresh in folks' minds, and people can just do a +1 for the thing that they like, and maybe we can try to move on from there. Did you have anything more on this?
Different, yeah, no, not on that. No. It was quite a surprise. Hum if you need a coffee.
But I think you're also the next on the agenda, right?
Yeah, I'm afraid.
Right, so we get to, I hope you all liked that, because now we're going to do
So
this.
I just made the mistake of trying to answer everything as if this was my proposal. I'm not going to do this time. I'm just going to read to you what this is and see what happens, because it isn't my proposal. I'm just trying to moderate this. Okay, parameters and defaults. Should we specify rather than recommend default values? The proposal is the red line here, right? That was Gory's proposal, if I remember correctly. Essentially replacing all the text about the default value could be or is recommended with, well, requirements language. Should we do that or not? And that enters a policy discussion, which is why I'm not going to answer comments. I'm just going to watch you. Yeah, that's the whole, that's what it is.
Yes to the coffee. Right. I was frightened that what we were doing was specifying something that somehow disagreed with what the IETF had written in other RFCs when we did default parameters things. So what? Yes, we do.
Well, sure we do.
I can give you examples.
A long one, I see.
Right. Right. So what do you want to announce, Michael?
I want to see if this pull request should be approved or not. Right? So this is yeah. Oh, okay. Sorry, it's not a pull request. It's an issue. Yeah, right. Okay. But I mean, if we should do this, could be a very easy way.
So one comment I have, like, I really don't see the policy matters for this must here. I mean, the policy can override the default. That's different thing. But here is more about the sentence, like saying like defaults must be this. And if some policy overrides default, that's a different factor for me.
Right. Exactly how I see it. Yes.
I was always happy that the policy could be overridden. I was unhappy by kind of saying the default is recommended to be something up. Well, let's just be bold. If we know what
exactly.
Saying must be this.
Yeah.
Default
must be.
Yeah. Override. Yes, allowed.
Eric Kinnear, Apple. So if you say the default must be this, is that the default for an implementation must be this, or the default in, like, basically are we saying that the default when I implement this, I need to specify this unless the client overrides it? That's okay. So at that point, we've already seen that for transport properties of a large number of protocols, different platforms have different defaults. Are we trying to say that the entire world should not have done that? And do we somehow believe that they will do this if we say it must be that? Like, is this going to be any more effective if we say must? Because we've already seen different platforms make their own choices.
I think the question is about requirement language or not. So we could have should for these cases, For cases where you think that this should be different on different platforms.
Should
Okay.
Gory, so as I understand it, your problem with the issue, your reason for filing the issue is that the language was kind of like, if you feel like it, maybe you could maybe have this as a default, if it's okay with you, right? Let me make an alternate suggestion here. The default is, because when you stick a must in there, yes. The default is. Can we just say the default is?
So I'm afraid I'm a little confused by this discussion because I thought the question was, should we have defaults?
Oh, no.
No, we are in agreement that there should be defaults.
Yeah, no, we're not reopening that.
Okay,
no.
so that's settled. All right, good.
Yeah, the default is. Done. Who's doing the PR?
But that's not requirements language. Okay.
No, it's not requirements language. It is less kind of up in the air than what we have is.
Okay.
So we avoid the lowercase recommend, which I really kind of annoyed me on something the IETF had done a must in this spec.
Okay. What's there is bad. Let's go with is. And if we want to reopen this in IETF last call and people are like, well, if it is, it should be must, then we can have that argument on the IETF list, which is.
That'll be more fun. Mary, do you have a comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, believe it or not, you can even specify whole protocols without normative language.
Yeah, and we're not doing a protocol.
And we're not even. So the reason to use normative language is because you want to make it like absolutely clear. I don't think that's super necessary here. And the other point to use a must is because you might have some interoperability issues. So, if you think that like it's important that all platforms use the same default because that's the assumption of the user and otherwise things will break, then that's something you should make clear and that would be a reason to use must, but I still think you shouldn't use normative language anyway.
The reason I wanted normative language in was because the things we were citing had normative language that said you must do this. So when we say the default is, well, you recommend this, because the RSC already said you must do soft arrows this way. If we just say is, I'm still very happy.
Yeah. If you include
I see, you basically contradicted if you say we recommend it, but then the RFC says must, and then what? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think there are two dimensions here also. Override could be not just the client, but it could all be like system policy or something. And I think the other part is that it's the default here is how we use it for the protocol selection and racing. So if we say ignore, it doesn't mean that you can ignore the feature necessarily. It just means that it's not used for selecting the protocol.
Yeah.
So that's also two different things that I think we got a bit confused in this discussion.
Agreed. And I think, Gory, that the point that you're making about how, a TAPS implementation should not use protocols in a way contrary to how they are specified. There should be some text somewhere in the implementation or in the API document that says that. If you're building a TAPS API, this isn't an excuse to put in a permanent hack that violates how we think the protocol should be used.
Teresa, again, it's JavaScript for Keith Moore. Please define things in such a way that applications behave predictably across different locations and different hosts. If defaults are implementation dependent, I don't think this happens.
I can't disagree with that.
Yeah.
So, did you have anything else?
Cool. No.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. We gained some time. And we made some progress. So, the next is Arch and API open topics.
Hi. So still the next round of someone moderating just stuff that has to be done. So for your information, I compiled a list of issues from GitHub that we might want to discuss today, if the time permits. So we go as far as we can get, and I sorted them a little bit across that we might make progress here, and they are not completely editorial. So if you don't find things that look editorial here, this is by intention. So the first issue I think we could discuss is the question of Tommy, whether listen filtering behavior for TLS should be somehow exposed. I put the T for TLS in brackets because I think that's a generally useful feature. The listen object delivers a connection, but doesn't provide a particular way to reject connections. So the text suggests that receive connection delivers the connection once the TLS server handshake is complete, but some implementations may want to rate limit or modify this behavior. So I think there are 3 possible resolutions. I don't read them aloud, but I think we should have a short discussion what makes most sense for this and probably just resolve this today. Okay.
Of these 3, I like resolution A. Match received event or connection events with listen calls. Primarily, it's a little bit weird. It means we might actually want to rename listen, because listen has, it's like listen and accept, they have meanings and sockets, and we're having slightly different, we have slightly different semantics for these now in TAPS, but I really like the symmetry between sort of like the receive connection back pressure and the receive back pressure. It makes sense to have like one way to do this.
Eric, as our one of our security representatives here, do you have an opinion? Do you want to generate an opinion on this while Tommy's talking?
Tommy Polly Apple. So this is something that we've discussed a lot. Specifically, we chose in our implementation not to do this, but instead to actually model the listening more on what the existing listen call has, which is kind of like a window of how many connections you want to receive. I think unlike a connection which I'm receiving data in which the application has some expectation of how much it's going to receive, a server that's receiving connections out of the blue really has no idea how many there could be. And adding these calls could either add latency, or I essentially have to call receive new connection 1,000 times if I want to be able to receive 1,000 connections at once and have that be the window. So having a convenience to just say, here's the window of how many more connections I'm willing to receive is useful. I think that's slightly different from what the issue is trying to get at, because even if I don't allow a connection to be received, I may want to do something before all of the application protocols start, so before TLS occurs, just to do some filtering. So they're related, but slightly different, right? Does that make sense?
That means your application looks like the non-TLS specific.
Not an additional event, but essentially an initial knob to say how many connections I'm going to accept. That's not TLS specific, but we may also need something, this was what the issue was, that allows us to reject certain connections from certain places, or like say, oh, my server doesn't, like, being under DOS, I want to reject everything from this subnet.
Yeah, Jonathan Lennox, just that point, one of the things when I was first learning sockets I always thought was really strange is that there's no way to respond to a SYN with a reset. So something, like for, stacks that are doing, not running on top of a kernel implementation, but actually doing their own TCP, you could even have a TCP layer potentially.
So I want to get back in line after listening to Tommy. I want to withdraw my statement on A. It's beautiful, but it's not practical. I'm not sure I agree that B is the right way to do this. I think we should probably continue the discussion somewhere else. I will note that I forget where it was, but I think it was in an early version of post sockets. There was essentially a pre-listening like event, which is essentially an event that came back to the application and said, would you like a connection that looks like this? Before I go to the whole effort of setting up all of the context and stuff, here is an incoming connection, and here is the remote address of it, and here's any information about the remote that we have. Do you care? And then at that point, it could essentially return no, right? Like, so in post, I think it was a callback, and it was like, it would return to Boolean, you know, do you want this? And it could be like, no, right? It would just drop out of, it was a way to short circuit the early processing. There are two different problems that we need to address here. One of them is back pressure, like the fundamental rate limiting problem, and one of them is sort of like early rejection. And I think we should probably either put something in this issue or split it into two different issues that points out that these are two different things that we need to control. But I don't, how many more of these do you have to go through?
Of these kind of questions?
Of these questions, of these issues, are we going to go through today?
I think 6 or 7.
We should probably make a note in the issue and move on, would be my, I don't think we're going to resolve on this one. Okay, cool. Yep, okay.
Okay, so, but I think the general, so just to ask the feeling, is adding an additional event for, let's say, pre-acceptance, a solution we might want to go with?
I think so.
So, yep. Anyone is speaking against it? Fine. I think we have a solution for that.
John, I mean, so, I mean, if I were getting a TLS connection, would I get this both at the TCP and the TLS? No, but would I get it then and get it again at TLS?
Here's a great connection.
No, and so, because the TCP layer might have a pre-connect, and the TLS layer would also have a pre-connect.
Yeah, once you have the search.
Yeah. So, any volunteers to write text for this?
Let's discuss first.
Okay, then I think we go for the next issue. Yeah. So there's a, issue 150, add unidirectional streams for multicast source and sync support. We have a selection property that allows to create unidirectional streams in the main document, but no way to query whether the connection is unidirectional. So the question is the mechanism sufficient for multicast? And
I think we want Jake's input on that since he's...
Right, I just wanted to say Jake implemented multicast in PyTAPS over the hackathon, and for him it was enough. We wouldn't have to query it, he would just make sure that if the local address is a group address and it isn't specified in a transport property that it has to be unidirectional receive stream, then it should just fail the connection, because then that's what he did.
Gori Fairhurst, I think we could do more for multicast. I think we should do the least. That sounded like what was already done, so I like what was done.
Okay. So I think the question is most probably yes, and the other extensions might come in with another PR from some of you. Okay. The next question is already answered, I think, in the last discussion. So I think framers are enough for the start TLS. So is there anyone against closing this? No, closing the issue. Yes. Yeah, okay. Okay. So we need text, and we need text for this in the implementation, but the issue itself is we have a sufficient mechanism for it. So there's the question between differentiating bad selection configurations from connection issues. So currently we just have one initiate error event that could be everything from racing failed to you just specified an unsatisfiable configuration with your transport properties. There are three ways, or two ways, which I could imagine to solve this. One is add another event that tells you that this is unsatisfiable, or the other one is to extend the initiation error to contain a reason
which could be configuration is unsatisfiable, or we don't have any candidates that satisfy your properties.
Teresa Enghardt, I'm in favor of B. I would like the initiation error to contain some kind of reason. Could be an implementation-specific enumeration or something. I think there's multiple like failure modes, and we want the initiation error to contain some information about why it failed, but I don't think that we right now can foresee all the different reasons why something might fail. And so I would say it should be information included in the error, but we can probably not specify all of them in the API document.
Hi, Brian Trammell. I'm a little confused because I thought, and maybe this text came out of the draft, or maybe I'm just thinking about post sockets and it never went into this draft, that if you try to initiate on unsatisfiable constraints, that shouldn't throw an event. It should give you an error on the call itself, right? Like the point of an initiation error, the reason that that's an event is that the initiation happens asynchronously. Whereas everything you know about an unsatisfiable selection configuration happens at call time. You have enough information to resolve the failure at the time that you make the call, so you don't have to queue an event because it's not asynchronous. And I don't recall whether that made it into TAPS or if I'm just remembering post sockets. Tommy, do you have?
I don't think initiate
has a return value.
return value as a connection.
Oh, right. Yeah, right. So in Go, you'd have a multiple thing, right? Yeah. But that having been said, I still think that we want to add additional information to the initiation error event because there are other asynchronous things that can happen, right? So yeah, I would suggest resolution B on this one.
Michael Lessel. I think Max has opened 2 or 3 issues that relate to communicating specific errors or adding information to errors. What about just adding a list in the appendix, just a list of error codes? Say these are initiation errors, these are these kinds of errors, and that's the explanation.
Yeah, Max Franke. First of all, it's somewhat related. I also opened an issue about initiation error being very specific right now when it should occur, and I think it should just be more generic because in the thing I just said about multicast, then it should fail. It should also be an initiation error if the local address is a group address, but it isn't a unicast receive stream. So that's the thing, and I think the error events like descriptions of errors or however you want to call it shouldn't just be on initiation errors, but maybe should be on all error events in general. That might be useful. Like you probably always want as much information as you can get from the events.
Tommy Pauling. Yes, so definitely of these in favor of B, and generally in favor of having fewer events with more descriptive errors being returned. And I think this is actually a broader API design thing, and we would look similar to some of the conversations we have around sending data and the various completions you can have to send. Like, I was able to send this, or I got an error, or maybe even if it was act. Having one event that you expect is a lot easier for the application to handle, right? Because if the application, depending on the language, has memory or state or actions that they need to be able to take, knowing that there will be one event that they need to handle in completion of an action as opposed to any number of things, that it just gets a lot more complex for them and less practical to hold the API. So I think when we're looking at things like this, unless we have a really good reason, we shouldn't be adding extra events that can just be communicated in single events.
So is there anyone who wants to make a PR and do a makeover of the error events to add reasons and make a proposal for text for that? Is there some volunteer? Max, you're volunteering? Okay.
Write it down quick, Corey.
Yeah, I'm just going to.
So there's an issue raised by Colin. Consider API that takes padding policy as an input. So padding is increasingly supported by transport. So for example, you could do a lot of padding stuff in now with UDP Lite, but you can also do this with Quick. And we have some use cases, especially for amplification prevention in Quick, that need some kind of control of padding. The question is whether we want to expose this functionality within tabs. I'm not asking how we want to expose them, just asking whether we want to expose it at all. And the reason why you might want to expose it in the transport is that you don't know the MTU, you don't know, for example, if this is padding before encryption, how much encryption or overhead there will be. So padding just a few too much bytes can just make your packet too big. So it makes sense to give this as an input through the transport. So the question is whether we want to include that.
Eric Kinnear, Apple. I think aside from the fact that like yay padding and good things to consider, padding is one of the things, like you said, with the overhead and especially on more expensive interfaces and things like that, there may be a cost. And so that's something where I think we have to expose it if we want to be able to do it. Because like you just said, the application doesn't know how to do it. And the protocol that knows how to do it doesn't know if it's allowed to do it. And that's kind of the definition of the things for which we need to expose an option.
So, Gori, if we have path MTU information, then maybe we can do something smarter here. Otherwise, we just do something stupid here.
Usually it's that way, but I think
Jonathan, I mean, while I agree this is a useful thing, I also feel like we do want to finish, and I feel like, just because we publish the first documents doesn't mean there's never going to be extensions. So I'm wondering if this should be, something that we start thinking about. Okay, what do we want as extensions to the base APIs?
So I think there should be a way in the API to support some kind of use of padding, but there might be different ways to implement it. Another way is to, tell the application what the maximum sizes the message can have, and the application can do the padding, or the other way around, tell the transport what the message sizes you want, and then the transport can do something.
But this can be problematic if you want to have really the padding to, for example, happen within Quick. Then you can't easily do it within the application if the transport stack is implemented.
You could tell Quick, please make sure all my messages have this size, and you either fill it with data or you fill it with padding. So the interface could talk about the message size instead of using padding as a function.
Okay, got you.
So somebody's going to start a API BIS?
Yeah. API X.
X?
X.
Next. API next.
Extensions.
Oh, extensions.
Yeah,
TAPS extensions.
That's a different working group.
Okay.
This is not the only one, so we will eventually need something like that.
Okay.
We should have a bucket to put it in, right? So it doesn't get old.
Okay. So suppose we just add a label on GitHub for the extensions and put this as the first one under this label.
Eric says it's not the first one, so maybe there's others.
Sorry, I know we're getting a bit tired here, but everyone had a slide at the beginning which said we're just about to finish these things.
Yes.
So what do we do with this list when we finish?
Well, we will decide that when we decide whether what happens with the working group. I mean, what I want to do is publish these 3 documents, right? If there are other documents that might happen in this group, it might happen somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, in some respects, I'm quite happy. I have it in the appendix somewhere that says, and there are other things, rather than try and thrash this out now.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. I'm making a stronger statement that we should note it somewhere where we are keeping track of things that we could do in the future. I'm not saying, I'm trying to push it out.
I would suggest that the GitHub issues list is the perfect place to do that. Stick a tag on it. Stick a tag on it that says, we create a new tag that's like, hey, things that are going to happen in extensions. Like we have decided as a working group, these don't go in the core docs, but we've also decided as a working group that we want to do them. So, and this is a trivially easy thing to add, right? Like, so it's a message context property, right? So
do you think that there is other future work besides extensions? Is there a different tag that is future work?
We just call it future work. Okay. Yeah, we don't even need it. I mean, like extension. I don't want to use. Yeah, you're right. We don't want to use the word extension because extension might mean something.
Exactly. I thought you were using it in a way that means something.
No, I wasn't. Sorry about that. Yeah. So future work. I will do that right now.
Okay. Okay. About 5 minutes, Philip.
Let's see what. Okay, we have another resolution. Yeah, should send return a message contact. This one is some kind of issue that started as more or less a semantic one, but turned out to be actually be two questions. So the first one is there are concerns that an often unused convenience return value could be harmful in some languages, which is the easy one, so just drop it if you don't like it. The second one is more interesting because send hours are currently one-to-one matched with send calls. So if you issue a send call, you get 1 cent error if this data wasn't sent. So for the first one, the question is, for the first one, so the original question, whether send should return a message context as a convenience or not, we have the resolution to either remove the message context as a return value or have it an optional one as a convenience and make it optional for languages that have problems with unused return values. Is there any?
Tommy, so my initial confusion here was, what is this return value? So if I call send and I give you a message context that here's the message I want to send, will the returned value ever be anything other than what I passed as the message context?
No, it will always be the message context you passed.
Okay. Right, which is a little confusing then. So the only case it is a relevant value is when I pass like a default or nil or something. I didn't specify anything. And then for some reason but then I realized that I want to care about what the value was, but I didn't want to create something to send.
So if you don't want to create a message context, but afterwards would like to introspect on which was the source address sent for the statogram or some other values that the transport system chose. That's the only reason. Or if you want to later on use it for reply matching, which we added. This is the only reason. These are the only reasons where you want to use this return value.
In that case, I would argue that you just always pass a value if you care about using it, and that should be very cheap. It should be easy to do, but you should pass the handle that you want because we already take that handle. Okay.
Yeah, and if there's something you want to learn about what the transport system chose and did, then that should be a queryable parameter or something like that, and not a result of send, which is just awkward in my opinion.
So, okay.
+2. This seems like it's very, very, very C API driven. And it seems like it's leaking sort of like specific language semantics into the API. I like Tommy's resolution here.
Okay, so
can we go ahead and close this one?
Yeah,
I'll do that.
We close the first half, and the second half is the more interesting one, I guess. The question is, send errors are currently one-to-one match with send calls. So if you have an application that's stupid and that writes byte-wise, and at some later point that's filling up some send buffer, and at some later point in time this connection dies and there's still stuff sitting in the send buffer, and there's a few kilobytes, then you get a few thousand send errors back. So the question is this the behavior we want, or do we want to have another way by saying either you could just get 1 cent error and some reason or some message context object telling you which sends failed, or have some property how to control the aggregation of these events.
Yeah, conflict. I don't see why we need to specify. I don't see why we have to specify whether sends match up with errors match up with sends or not.
Because the document currently says that especially if for each send call you did, you get a send error event potentially.
Well, yes, you potentially get a send error event, but that doesn't mean that the implementation has to generate a send error for every byte if you're sending bytewise.
As I read the document currently, it would be.
I mean, if you call send, you may get a send error. That doesn't mean you have to get a send error for every send. That's an implementation choice as to whether it batches up the errors and gives you just one or not. It's up to the stack, sure.
We are out of time for this session. Okay. So now you're eating into a discussion of Yang models.
Okay. So it sounds like your assumption is that every send will eventually either get an error or a sent, right?
Yes. That's what it is today.
Okay, so it's not just that it may get a send error. It's like it will definitely get either success or failure.
And they change that so
that there's such a thing as like a final error on the connection, after which everything after that gets neither success or failure.
I think we should take this discussion to the list. I have more, but I think we should discuss the Yang model.
Should we just see the slides? Push them off the list. Well, they're only issues.
Yeah, so the next questions are basically how to handle protocol stacks that are not equivalent. Draft should point at existing implementations, and implementation should separate out protocol-specific bits.
So perhaps as a way to move forward, you could just take the text with links to the issues and send those as individual messages to the TAPS list, and we could try to get a little bit of discussion on there and see if we can make some progress.
Okay.
But it does seem, if we aren't able to do that, it seems like this is good material for an interim.
Yeah.
I thought he said you were closing the first half, but.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Philip. Yeah, that's the wrong agenda.
Hello. So I'm not going to talk a lot about Yang actually, but mostly about testing tabs, because that's what we were using the Yang model for in the hackathon. So Max, Jake, and I were basically participating in the hackathon the entire weekend and doing various things like implementing multicast. But what I focused on was on testing. So what we are using Yang for right now is, so you have, we're creating a pre-connection, and you have to specify a remote endpoint, a local endpoint, transport properties, and security parameters, as you can see above. And of course, all of these have to be filled first with like some content. And now what the Yang file gives us is that we essentially substitute all those 4 parameters and the initial like filling those parameters with data. We substitute all that with a Yang file, which contains like some remote endpoint address or host name and port and transport properties and security parameters and all this stuff. It's in a single file. It's easy to refer to. For example, in a test case, I can say, okay, I have my UDP client.json, and then I throw it into my test and I send something, I get something else, I get something back, I check whether it's what I expected. And the advantage of having it in a model is that it's easier to port across implementations. So I'm going to go back to this later on. So this is sort of the benefits of Yang that I got. And the pain points is actually, or it's not actually that much of a pain point anymore once you have it, but getting it to work is first a little bit weird because there's different implementations of Yang, but PyYang was too painful for validating instances of models for some reason. So what we are using for PyTAPS right now is basically a C++ library. You have to install this library and you have to build it, and we got it to work. So there's a shell script. So if you check out our repo and you just run this script, it works on Linux and macOS on our machine. So actually it's not that bad to get it to work, but it's sort of a little bit ugly. But yeah, so what we did with this model was I wrote some tests, basically sending data, and then I'm running an echo server and getting back data. So I test whether TCP works, whether UDP works, whether TLS works. And next steps could be to also test, like, for example, failure modes. And while testing these, of course, we found some issues in the code, some bugs to fix, but also I looked a little bit more at the model. And for example, the security parameters right now in the model have the identity and the algorithm as required. So you always have to specify a algorithm, and I think it's not always necessary. For example, if I give a certificate, and in the certificate, the algorithm is already in there, right? So like my application doesn't necessarily have to give me an algorithm just because it gives me a certificate. And also, maybe I'm a client, maybe I don't have my own certificate, and then I don't have to give my certificate to like the API, right? So they could both be optional depending on whether I'm a server or a client in TLS, for example. So this should probably be optional. And then another suggestion was to sort of do more sanity check for this pre-connection and endpoint configuration that we're getting. So for example, we could check if at least one endpoint has been specified in this JSON file, right? Because either it's a client or a server, either it needs a local or a remote endpoint. And we could check that. And we could also check if there's transport properties in there that exclude each other. But if we don't do that, then our implementation should throw an error that those properties exclude each other, something like that. So again, what the Yang model gives us is that we have the pre-connection and the endpoint sort of all in the same file specified, and we can do sanity checks on them first, and then we can throw those files into the implementation and see what the implementation does with it, and hopefully PyTAPS does a similar thing with the Yang file than, for example, Apple implementation does. So that's the basic idea. Also, we could add profiles to the Yang model, but I guess we would have to agree on profiles first. Right. So two really interesting points that came up in the hackathon was first, the Yang model includes an interface type. And I remember the discussion we had on interface types. So there's an IANA IF type Yang module, which contains lots and lots of different link types. So there's 802.11 is in there. I found it. I'm not sure I actually found the different cellular like links, but I guess they're probably also in there. And then there's like hundreds of different link types that I don't really know. But right now the Yang model that Jake wrote imports sort of those link types. So you can like say, I require Wi-Fi, and then you're using this. And in our API draft, we are not pointing to any specific registry of different link types or different interface types, but we leave it up as implementation specific. So it could just be a string saying Wi-Fi or like an enum or something. So I was just wondering, like, do we still want this, or I don't know, just found it interesting because Jake just used the module, right? So, and the other thing which we maybe really want is that we could also model our output, or essentially what we get from the TAPS implementation. So for example, we get a TCP connection with a specific remote and local endpoint and over an interface. And maybe if we model this connection state that we get as an output, then we have a portable input, which is like pre-connection and endpoint configuration. And we might have also a portable output. That is the connection that we got, maybe, or just the protocol that we got. And then we could test whether given a certain input, whether our implementation produces the expected output. And if both of these are portable, then we could run essentially similar tests on different implementations. And portability and like checking that this is actually valid or invalid input might be something that becomes easier with Yang, because otherwise we would probably have to check it in some other way, but also maybe not. So this is what I was wondering, whether there's any kind of like interoperability, portability tests that we can define. And then also, of course, for testing, we might want some tests whether our implementation satisfies the API contract. So we've been talking a lot about different issues that came up when implementing, and maybe if I do this, then will my application return me 1 cent event or multiple or something like that. And we could put those into test cases, and then it would be easier for example, the different implementations to make sure they are all doing the same thing and the correct thing. So those are the ideas that I had to that. Any ideas?
Hello, this is Tommy. So first, thank you for doing this, and also thank you for all the work that you did at the hackathon to get this going. This is really cool. One comment is that, like, whatever we're doing with like the Yang document, like this feels actually where like the profiles idea could go or should go, right? Because this is really the part of that. That's various comments. Sorry, Maria. But then the other point regarding testing, this is something that we discussed at the hackathon, and so maybe if other people have thoughts on this too. If we want to check the output of what the TAP system ends up doing based on the input we give it, so we could either have, essentially a standard way in which all the systems export what they chose to do, but that may be a little tricky because when we have more heuristics, we'll do different orderings, it'll be hard to validate. The other alternative is to essentially have another Yang model or whatever configuration for a server and go through impairing or turning off parts of the server. So, make the server only listen on one address or address family or only one protocol or something like that, and validate that the client is always able to do some racing that ends up connecting. Because we don't necessarily care about the order as much as we do the end result, that we are still resilient to however it works. So that's another approach we can take.
Yeah, so that would already be possible with the current Yang model, I think. We have one Yang file for the server, one Yang file for the client. We sort of let them do their thing, and then we see what the output is.
Yeah. Just to add on the profiles comment, so actually I got a little bit convinced by listening to you that I don't want profiles, because I think Yang models are just a different way to implement profiles.
No. Well, I'm sorry. Okay. So another idea that we had to model, I'm not sure why it's not on the slides, but we could also model that a given transport protocol implements reliability check, implements order check, like this kind of thing, right? So we could add that to the model as well. I'm not sure if that's what you mean by profiles.
I don't know. I mean, like a profile gives you a certain set of parameters that you set, and the Yang model gives you a certain set of parameters that you set, right?
So I believe you're just describing a way of describing profiles. Not that we don't need profiles. You're just saying that you can describe them using Yang.
Yeah. But I actually, because you can just do it. It's a configuration file, right? That's what we're kind of talking about. It doesn't have to be a configuration file. It's a set of parameters for configuration.
I thought the point of profiles was to help applications request useful sets of behaviors. So what she's coming up with descriptions of useful sets of behaviors in doing her testing, writing that stuff down and making it available to applications developers makes it so they don't have to do that same figuring out that she's doing, right? I thought that's the point of profiles. So
it's the same. Like I write a bunch of Yang models and I put them somewhere. People can download them and use them.
Yes, absolutely. Maybe you publish them in an internet draft so people know what's in there.
Sorry, but no, I do not think it is a reasonable expectation for like an arbitrary iOS app developer to learn how to write a Yang or how to use a Yang model. So I see those as completely separate points. So this is for me for testing, and like me and Max and Jake can use it. Perhaps Apple people can also use it, but like an arbitrary like application developer, we won't ask them to use Yang, right?
No, it's one implementation of a profile. And therefore, it's a thing that should be discussed in implementation draft.
Max Frankel, the point, like a Yang model is more than just the profile from transport properties, right? You model endpoints and things like that.
Yeah.
So you would have to have a system. If you just want the Yang model for the endpoint, then basically the whole Yang model we have right now would have to change, and you would have to have separate Yang models for the endpoints and models for the transport properties and so on. And then you would have to load multiple models. And I think the profiles are an easier way. Also, you would have to validate the Yang files and so on. So you have overhead and things like that. I'm not sure that's really.
Well, we could model the profile using the Yang model.
You can model the profile in the Yang model, but I don't. But I think you should also have.
Okay.
How to design a profile?
Right. Okay. Well.
I'm not convinced.
So we have 0 minutes left.
Oh.
So you're now on your own time.
Let Jake
Carry on.
say something.
You're Mr. Yang. Say something.
All right. So I guess I have a clarifying question. Like, are you suggesting that we have profiles in the Yang model, but also define the profiles in terms of the features that they implement? Or are you suggesting that we do not have profiles and instead only have the features and define all of those? Okay. So the second, I think that would make the Yang models less useful, in my opinion, just because part of the point is that they're relatively simple to edit, that looking at them in a way that's similar to looking at the source code, at least in my mind. Part of what I hope to do is that you edit it in kind of the way you edit the source code, but it's easier, right? But it would work in several different locations. And so, like, the same reasons that it's easier for the user to use a profile instead of using all of the individual, an application developer. The same reason that it's easier for an application developer to use a profile instead of using all the values. I think it's easier to define a profile for the application, to specify a profile for the application developer than it is to define all the values. Or maybe there's an edit to the Yang model that would make it reasonable to do that, but it's not immediately apparent to me what that would be.
Okay, I suggest we figure out whether we want profiles in the API draft or appendix or wherever before we discuss further, like, where it goes.
Can you wrap it up, Teresa?
Interim.
Where people are missing
Yeah,
cookies. Oh, you're done?
I'm done.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Before people leave the room, I'm sorry. I would just like to propose that we do a virtual interim in September. Does anybody have a real problem with that? We can work out the dates online. Okay, I see some heads nodding and thumbs up. I don't see anybody saying that's a really bad idea. Okay, thanks, everybody. Thanks to Corey for taking notes and for Teresa for JavaScribing, and we'll see you online. Thank you.